There is a population living in Japan today that Japanese scientists spent decades trying to explain. A people with thick beards, deep-set eyes, and wave-like tattoos covering their faces and arms. A people who worshipped bears, who sang in a language with no known relatives anywhere on Earth, who hunted and fished on the northern islands of the Japanese archipelago long before the civilization we associate with Japan ever existed, the Ainu. And when scientists finally extracted their DNA and ran the analysis, the results created more questions than they answered. For most of recorded Japanese history, the Ainu were treated as an anomaly, something to be explained away, assimilated, or simply ignored. The Japanese government did not officially recognize them as an indigenous people until 2019. For generations, their children were taken from traditional communities and placed in boarding schools. Their language was suppressed. Their ceremonies were banned. But biology does not forget, and the genome remembers things that history tries to erase. To understand why the Ainu discovery shook the scientific community, you need to understand the standard model of how Japan was populated. For decades, researchers believed the Japanese archipelago was settled in two major waves. First came the Jomon people, hunter-gatherers who arrived in Japan somewhere between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier, and who lived there largely undisturbed for thousands of years. Then, around 900 BCE, a new group arrived from the Asian mainland, farmers, known as the Yayoi, who brought rice agriculture, metalworking, and a very different genetic profile. The modern Japanese population, in this model, is a mixture of those two groups, mostly Yayoi, with a layer of Jomon ancestry underneath. The Ainu, the theory went, were simply the closest living descendants of the original Jomon people. The remnant, the holdover, it was a clean story, logical, tidy. It was also incomplete. When researchers began applying modern whole genome sequencing to Ainu individuals, not just looking at single genetic markers, but reading the full length of their DNA, the results did not fit the simple Jomon descendant framework. Yes, the Ainu carried high proportions of Jomon ancestry, significantly higher than mainland Japanese populations. That part held. But there was something else in the genome, a signal pointing in a direction no one had anticipated. Deep within Ainu DNA, researchers identified ancestry components that connected them not just to ancient Northeast Asian populations, but to groups associated with the ancient peopling of the Americas, and with populations from much further north, Siberian and Arctic adjacent lineages that had no obvious route into the Japanese archipelago under the existing migration models. Some studies flagged a genetic affinity between the Ainu and certain Native American populations, not a direct connection but a shared ancestral thread. A common source population somewhere in the ancient past whose descendants split and traveled in radically different directions. Some went east across Beringia and eventually populated the Americas. Others went south and reached Japan. The implications were staggering. What this suggested was that the Jomon people themselves, the original settlers of Japan, were not a single homogeneous group who arrived in one wave. They were the product of multiple ancient migrations, some of which originated in populations that were ancestral to both Northeast Asians and the first Americans. The Jomon were, genetically speaking, more cosmopolitan than anyone had imagined, and the Ainu, as their closest living descendants, carry that complexity more visibly than any other population in Japan. A major 20-20 study using high-coverage whole genome sequencing of Ainu individuals and comparing them against a global reference panel found that the Ainu showed the highest Jomon-related ancestry of any modern group tested, over 60% in some analyses. But the remaining ancestry told a more complicated story, with contributions from ancient Siberian-related populations and a smaller layer of Yayoi-related mainland ancestry from more recent historical contact. This was not the profile of a simple, isolated remnant population. This was the profile of a people who represented one of the oldest and most genetically distinct lineages in all of East Asia. And then there is their language. The Ainu language is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no demonstrated relationship to Japanese, to Korean, to any Siberian or Tungusic language family, to Chinese, or to any other language on Earth. It stands completely alone. And that linguistic isolation mirrors something the genetics keeps pointing to, that the Ainu are not simply an older version of their neighbors. They are something genuinely different, a separate branch of the human family tree that grew in remarkable isolation for thousands of years. The physical differences that were always visible now had a scientific foundation. The Ainu often display features described as more similar to certain Southeast Asian or even Western Eurasian populations than to their East Asian neighbors. Heavier body hair, more pronounced facial features, lighter skin in some individuals. For a long time, these differences were used to marginalize them, to treat them as primitive, to place them outside the boundaries of what Japan considered its own. What genetics revealed was that those differences were not a sign of backwardness. They were a sign of extraordinary antiquity. The Ainu are not behind the curve of Japanese history. They predate it. There is a concept in population genetics called genetic drift. When a small population becomes isolated, whether by geography, by culture, or by circumstance, random changes in their gene pool accumulate over generations in ways that would not happen in a large, interconnected population. The Ainu experienced profound isolation for thousands of years on Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands. That isolation deepened their genetic distinctiveness over time, but isolation alone cannot explain everything the genome shows. The ancestral signals that reach toward Siberia, toward ancient populations connected to the first Americans, toward lineages that crossed the ancient northern world. Those signals are not the product of isolation. They are the product of an origin story far older and far more complex than anyone suspected. Today, there are estimated to be somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 Ainu people remaining, though the true number may be higher given generations of cultural suppression and mixed ancestry. Many no longer speak the language. The traditional ceremonies, the bear rituals, the oral epics called yukar, most exist now only in recordings and academic archives. But their DNA persists. In every Ainu individual alive, the genome carries a record stretching back tens of thousands of years, to the Jomon hunters, who first crossed into the Japanese archipelago, and further still, to the ancient Siberian populations who were ancestral to people on opposite ends of the earth. What the science ultimately revealed was not just a story about one indigenous group in one corner of Japan. It was a story about the peopling of an entire region of the world, about the routes that ancient humans took across Ice Age landscapes that no longer exist, about migrations that shaped populations from Hokkaido to the coasts of North America. The Ainu were the key that unlocked a much larger door, and the world, as the researchers put it, simply was not ready for what was behind it. Japan has spent much of its modern history constructing a narrative of ethnic homogeneity. One people, one culture, one unbroken line of ancestry stretching back into the mists of ancient history. The genetics of the Ainu do not destroy that narrative, but they complicate it in ways that cannot be ignored, because before the rice farmers arrived, before the Yayoi crossed from the mainland, before any of what we call Japanese civilization began, there were people already there, people who had been there for thousands of years, people whose genome connected them to the ancient world in ways that even now, with all the technology at our disposal, we are still struggling to fully understand. The Ainu did not need science to tell them they were different. They always knew. It just took the rest of the world a very long time to start listening.